YouTube? Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart here for the podcast. We're talking Auburn football sports talk. Go ahead and like the video, comment, and subscribe to Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn. We're talking about episode number 5 of projecting Auburn's 2020 football schedule, which includes a lot of interesting teams this year. Of course, Auburn doesn't have to open up with a big-time Power 5 football team that has aspirations to win their conference, which takes away a little bit of the anxiety, say like last year. I mean, it was a ton of anxiety. You talk about Gus Malzahn on the hot seat, as he tends to be, at least hypothetically, if you think about the Auburn fan base. Auburn has this, Gus Malzahn has this very interesting love-hate relationship, and no one in their at least perceptual right mind will just come out publicly and say that they absolutely love Gus Malzahn for the sake of being called, say, a sunshine pumper, or just unrealistic, or drowning in accepting mediocrity, things of that nature. But I have my opinions about Gus Malzahn's tenure at Auburn, which I think is more so plagued by, he's just now, I think his staff, I think his whole operation at Auburn, they're just now kind of sort of learning to recruit. Then you'll have that portion of the Auburn fan base that will dismiss the recruiting efforts because, they feel that Auburn is behind on facilities and, different entities of a program that would attract some of the more elite athletes in college football. So when we look at this particular schedule, of course, you don't have the anxiety of having to face a Clemson or a USC or like last year, Oregon, or maybe even Washington from the year before, where both of those teams, all of those teams have aspirations, obviously, to win their particular conference. Washington won their conference back in 2018. Subsequently, Oregon, the win over Oregon in Arlington, Texas in the Advocare Classic. Oregon eventually won the Pac-12 conference. And really looking at Oregon's schedule, had it not been for an inexplicable loss to Arizona State, probably could have actually taken that 4th spot in the college football playoffs on last year. But Oregon has been pretty much for the last few years, outside of their tenure as being regulars in the college football playoff and wreaking havoc in the Pac-12 conference, they usually wind up finding a way to lose an inexplicable game where they have much more talent, much better coaching, much more access to higher level recruiting. Actually lost to a true freshman in that game against Arizona State, but subsequently won not the Iron Bowl, but the Rose Bowl. I don't know where the Iron Bowl comes into play, but they actually won the Rose Bowl this past year over Wisconsin in a very close game, 28-27. But that game actually put Oregon in a different kind of stratosphere to where we're beginning to think that Oregon will be back on that particular plane once again as one of the somewhat elite teams in college football. So Auburn doesn't have to deal with that, but they do have the challenge of facing North Carolina, who really took Clemson down to the wire. Probably an inexplicable play call there at the end that, probably could have put North Carolina in a position to have upset Clemson. Clemson actually goes on to the college football playoff in the national championship game, actually being manhandled by LSU in that particular game. Ironically, another SEC team. So when we look at Auburn's schedule, you talk about a nice stretch that, starts with Alcorn State, next week North Carolina, then stretches all the way down to the Georgia and Texas A&M game, which will be, I think, the 2 pivotal games of the season that will definitely decide what Auburn's fate is going down the stretch and the possibility of competing for the SEC West. The reason why I think Georgia and Texas A&M will be pivotal games, those are 2 weeks apart, and those are the more elite teams in the SEC that could go a long way in deciding the outcomes of the SEC and who will actually appear in the SEC championship game at the time that those games are played. But Auburn actually has a bye week in between Texas A&M and Mississippi State. So with all of that in mind, as we start to navigate the season, we look at last year in 2019, where Auburn did a really good job of actually dodging those, detrimental injuries that normally plague them during the middle of the stretch. And we will see how those things play out as this particular season unfolds. Assuming that with the current pandemic of COVID-19 that a season will even take place. So after that, you got Auburn against Mississippi State. I think that should be a win for Auburn. Arkansas usually for the past few years has been a pretty decent win. But then you get to after the two game SEC stretch, which should yield Auburn a couple of more wins in the SEC West and possibly making some noise later on in the season. You have sandwiched in between Arkansas and LSU a really interesting game against Umass. Now, UMass is actually a team out of Massachusetts, oddly enough. Spent a lot of years as an FCS school, actually won the 1998 FCS title. That is the only claimed national championship that they have garnished in their many years of college football. As a matter of fact, they're one of the oldest standing college football teams in the country at this point, but not particularly known as a college football powerhouse, more so known for their position in the Atlantic 10 for a very long time as a very good basketball team. As a matter of fact, Marcus Camby back in the late 90s was one of the more elite players to come out of that particular college. Now, I say that to say this. This should not be a game where Auburn is severely challenged on any level. By now, Auburn's offense should be firmly established. We will get to see by then how the offensive line plays a part. We do know that with this particular year, Auburn should have a lot more access to more elite talent at the skill position, loaded at the running back position, a lot more height at the wide receiver position. Of course, having the offensive coordinator Chad Morris, who will have been able to figure out how to implement the tight end, how to implement all of his skilled players. I think Chad Morris will have a lot more talent at his disposal than he had at Arkansas while head coach there. Had a little success at Clemson, but we will see how he handles the talent at Auburn. But when we think about a game like UMass, one of the main storylines of the game with UMass is Auburn is actually paying out $1.9 million to play this particular game, and for several reasons. Here's my take. I don't worry about what the actual take is, but here's my take. For one, late in the season, it's going to be very hard to find, after you have already played your conference teams, it's going to be hard to find another team that is actually willing to play you, especially a team that has aspirations to win their conference. Obviously, is not going to want to play Auburn in the middle of the season, and Auburn is not going to want to play them. So you're going to have to find a team that is willing to pay. So Auburn, back in 2017, signed a contract for $1.9 million, which meant that is going to be the highest payout in the University of Massachusetts history as far as playing against another FBS football team. So Auburn's going to pay out $1.9 million to actually play this team. So if Auburn loses this game, it's going to be not only an embarrassment from a perceptual standpoint with recruits and guys of that nature, it's also going to be very devastating to the budget because you don't want to pay $1.9 million to lose a football game. Also, when you look at what UMass has done against other Power 5 teams, this hadn't even been close. They've even lost to other FCS schools by more than 3 touchdowns. So I don't think that this is going to be a game that Auburn really necessarily has to worry about. But you think about all the money that Auburn is going to be kicking out, and then this absolutely has to be a tune-up game for Auburn. They don't need to struggle on any level with this particular football game because after UMass, you have LSU and you have Alabama. No matter how the cookie crumbles, no matter how you look at it, and if you look at it from a historical standpoint, LSU, Alabama, and Auburn, for the past few years, their encounters with one another has decided the SEC West in some form or fashion. But it's going to be a little bit different this year because these games are not scheduled apart from one another. The reason why this is taking place is because usually Auburn takes on Georgia during the same week that they're going to, around the same week that they would have been facing UMass. So now the SEC West, no matter how you put it, is going to be decided within the last 2 weeks of this particular season. Said before, the biggest, really one of the biggest ties that these two teams have, Auburn and UMass. If we all remember this past year, we had a guy named Jack Driscoll, who is now playing for the Philadelphia Eagles. He was actually an offensive lineman at UMass who transferred to Auburn and has had a pretty decent showing and garnished himself a place in the NFL. I'm looking at a game like Auburn versus UMass to go kind of like, the game against Liberty from last year, the game against Sanford from the year before. Those little warm-up games that happen right before everything is really on the line. One thing Auburn doesn't want to do is have a struggle game here to where they have to come back from behind to win, to where they're still trying to figure out the offense. Because I remember late last season, Gus Malzahn made a crazy public relations type statement in saying that, basically we're still trying to figure the offense out. 2020, you got a starting quarterback. Your starting quarterback is returning. Bo Nix, freshman of the year in the SEC last year, really made some strides late in the season. Much better decision making. Started to get a lot more comfortable with transferring his abilities from high school football. Ironically enough, he played his last high school football game in Jordan-Hare Stadium in the ASHAA, which is the Alabama High School Association, in the highest level of football in Alabama, winning the state championship in Jordan-Hare Stadium. So you have all of that returning. You have all of the skilled players returning. You also have the emergence of the possibility of Tank Bigsby, who is the highest rated recruit in the 2019 recruiting class. Not sure why he's not a 5-star recruit. He was a 5-star. Then you look back at the 24/7 Sports. Now he's back down to a 4-star, 98% rating. Give the man his extra star. But he's doing some workouts to take his game to the next level. We will see how he breaks out as a football player for the Auburn Tigers. Definitely think that the Auburn defense will not necessarily pick up where they left off, because you just can't replace Marlon Davidson and Derek Brown and some of the other talent that you had there on the defense. But the recruiting classes over the last few years should give the Auburn defense an opportunity to actually somewhat reload as far as talent goes. Fortunately, you still have the coaching staff still in place outside of Marcus Woodson, who departed for Florida State. You still have some continuity with the coaching staff, that same level of, expectation, that same level of what you want to produce brand-wise on the football field should still be there. I'm looking at a very easy win for Auburn, but I just want you guys to keep in mind, Auburn is paying out $1.9 million to UMass, and it would be a doggone shame if Auburn found a way to struggle in this game, or worst case scenario, does the Florida against Georgia Southern thing, or does the LSU against Troy thing, or even does the epic. This is the game that got all of the possibilities of this started, when Michigan actually lost at home to Appalachian State. Definitely don't want this to happen, and you don't want the scare that Auburn had back in 2015 when they lost to Jacksonville. Well, when they almost lost to Jacksonville State. Needed an overtime win over in-state foe Jacksonville State to win that game. That would have been lethal for Gus Malzahn's career at Auburn. All right, guys, what do you think about UMass being on the schedule? A sleeper for Auburn, but just keep in mind that $1.9 million that Auburn is paying out to actually play this particular football game. So that is what is at stake. The potential of losing or struggling with a team that you paid $1.9 million for several reasons that I don't have time to talk about in this particular video. Go ahead and like the video, comment, and subscribe to Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn. This is episode number 5 of projecting Auburn's football season. And as always, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger, War Eagle.